Another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we got a friend of the show who was on back in May. Matt, it's great to have you on. We're going to talk a little bit about the Lane Kiffin saga that, quite frankly, never seems like it's ending. Isn't that right?
You couldn't be telling the truth more. So, but absolutely, where Lane goes, the drama follows.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just been so many different media outlets and different beat writers saying, "Oh, LSU's offering this figure. Oh, Florida's offering that figure." Then you hear the athletic director make that what was essentially really a nothing announcement saying, "Hey, we're going to have a decision by the end of the Egg Bowl." So it's totally possible that this Kiffin announcement is just going to completely override all the Saturday games in that regard. But in any event, I'm not. We know where it's at, right, between LSU and Florida and Ole Miss. So my two-part question to you is: one, where do you think he's heading? And number two, in terms of his legacy or in terms of just him as a football coach, how, if you were a player or someone on a staff, how would you perceive this ongoing drama, dilemma, whatever you want to call it? How would you perceive that?
Um, well, first off, I definitely can see him going to LSU. Um, they have a nice, you know, they have a nice history there, and that's kind of where he seems to, kind of veer off to. I mean, you go back and look at, when he was at Tennessee, he was, the offensive coordinator at USC for a little while. Um, but yeah, I could definitely see him at LSU. I think it's either there or he stays. And I don't think he's staying because go back and look at his track record. He doesn't stay in one spot, for too long. He's all about, just kind of moving from place to place to place to place. I think people get fed up with him after a little while. Um, but I think at the same time, you're willing to, kind of suck it up to your program to, 10-2 or 11-1 or, whatever it's kind of, going to be, you'll get a bowl game, a solid bowl game out of it. And now with the playoff, you're going to get a playoff appearance. I don't think anybody sees them losing the Egg Bowl this weekend. So again, you'll have the opportunity to go to the playoff, probably be a 6 or 7 seed. You'll get a good matchup, which you probably should win, depending on who they get paired up with. Um, and if I'm a player, I think it depends. It depends on, I think, what position you play in. I think it depends on, kind of what part of life you're in. Like, are you junior, senior coming in, and you're like, all right, I got a couple years here. I can really focus. I can be on a good team. I can get some national coverage, maybe to kind of vault me into the NFL. If you're a younger player, I may kind of skew away from that, maybe go somewhere else because you don't know if he's going to be there the entire duration of your college career, maybe all 4 years. You may go to somewhere, maybe like a Georgia, to where that the coach is going to be there a while. You may go somewhere, like USC, where Lincoln Riley is going to be around, and maybe you only spend 2 years at one of those programs. Go somewhere else. But when it comes to, Lane Kiffin and the drama, I don't know if you remember, Rob, that when he was, at his short tenure at Tennessee, and there were questions about whether he was going to stay or whether he was going to leave. And I don't know if I don't want to quote this because I don't know if it's correct, but I remember watching one of his press conferences, and he was talking about, I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm ready to be here for the long term. I'm ready to sing Rocky Top, when we win some of these big games. And then flash forward a little while longer, Lane was on to the next big thing. And that's just kind of what Lane does.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot of great points there too, just between how the kids would feel because if I were a player on that team, my immediate thought would be is if you were really committed to Oxford, Mississippi, if you were committed to bringing a national championship here, you wouldn't put up with this nonsense of media outlet people questioning you for the past week and a half, 2 weeks in terms of where you're going. Now, there could be an angle of maybe he's using this as a way to get more NIL money. Maybe it's a way to have more say on his roster. Maybe there's an outlier thing that Keith Carter and Lane Kiffin have talked about that somehow no other media person in the country knows about. However, what I will say in a somewhat comical but in all serious way is how this hasn't been leaked yet. I'm surprised that the cat hasn't been out of the bag yet because my other thought was kind of like I for damn sure thought that this would kind of happen by now in terms of a decision, but I'm almost kind of glad that this is kind of lingering on because if he does leave, one, this would just be unprecedented in general, right? Because, how many times in history have we seen a coach that could be on the precipice of winning a national championship leave midseason to go to a school, not only just a different school, but a school within your conference? I mean, if that's not a slap in the face, I don't know what is. But as a head coach, I mean, you have to sit there and say to yourself too, exactly as articulated as well, it's just part of him as a person. I think even though he sometimes can be short with the media, sometimes he can be snippy with them. I think deep down he likes the attention. I think likes the kind of narratives that people kind of throw out there. I think maybe he gets a kick out of it, but I think there will be a part of him deep down that if he leaves and doesn't bring a national championship to Baton Rouge or Gainesville, there's going to be that part of him that's going to regret that because you're going to have that what if in your life. And I think that's something that I think he seriously has to wrestle with because I think he's going to go to LSU. But if I were his agent, I would tell him to stay in Oxford, win the 10, 11 games a year. If you win a national championship, great. If not, you're going to have a trophy in the stadium named after you 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the whole reason he'll probably go to LSU. If you're worried about NIL, if you're worried about, being able to kind of get recruits to come somewhere, and maybe, in your mind, it's easier to get recruits to come to, Baton Rouge and, play for LSU with the kind of luster and, everything that you can bring in there. And you can say, look, we've won, national championships here before. You can be the next, with Joe Burrow. You can be the next, Jaden Daniels. You can be the next, Jamar Chase. You can be the next, litany list of players. What can you really say as far as, Ole Miss? What you're going to be the next, Jeremy Tunsil. You're going to be the next, Eli Manning. Um, I I don't know if there's any credibility to this. I know I had heard some rumors that when he was interested in going to Florida, they told him that if he was going to come, he had to come right then and there because they wanted him to be there to recruit, and that he wasn't going to be able to work the rest of the season for Ole Miss. I wonder if that's kind of something that maybe he talked to LSU about and was like, you know, maybe that's something they're kind of going back and forth on now. Is that, hey, if LSU said, hey, I need you to be here, before the season's over, so we can go ahead and get a head start on recruiting, and maybe he's kind of wrestling with that. Maybe it's not one of those things that he wants to do, but I don't know if that's part of the holdup. I can see why it would be, or if it was. Um, I don't know about if it was me or you in there. I'd like to think that if it was myself, I would do the same thing. That I would have to kind of make a decision at some point. And if you were serious about staying where you were and not going somewhere else, why not have a press conference and say, "Look, I'm going to address this once. I'm not going to address it again. I'm staying here. I don't want anybody else to have to worry about it. We're focused on one goal, and that's to win the national championship here. Um, period. End of discussion. Next question, please." Like it's that easy to just kind of squash it. Um, you know, we talked about before we came on it. It's very reminiscent of back when Jimbo Fisher was at Florida State, and there were rumors of him 2 years in a row leaving. Once it was to go back to LSU as the head coach. Another time it was to Texas A&M, and you just kind of get the feeling that this happens a lot more than it should, and these coaches don't always necessarily take the high road and be like, "Look, I'm staying here." period, end of discussion. I don't want to talk about this anymore because I don't want my guys to get distracted. I don't want my guys to worry about, am I going to be here, in 2 games? Am I going to be here in 4 games? I made a, commitment to these kids. I made a commitment to this program, and that's where I'm going to be.
Yeah, and Matt, just to remind me too, how many national championships has Lane Kiffin won?
That'd be the Oregon logo.
And how many conference championships has he won?
Say it's 0 as well. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of fascinating how we're having this big conversation about Lane Kiffin? There's reports out there that he can make anywhere from $13 to $15 million. And when you really think about it, there's guys like Ed Orgeron, for example, and Gene Chizik and Gus Malzahn who have won national championships and have won conference championships. But yet we're giving all this attention to somebody that really, when you kind of look at it that way, hasn't really proven that he can even take you to the national championship, because that's what you're paying him for, essentially, right? And I talked about this before with some of my other buddies too, and this isn't me discrediting Lane, because I still think Lane Kiffin is a top 10 coach in college football, but it's just me articulating that, hey, you're still taking a big gamble, even paying him all this money to begin with. Because granted, like, he deserves credit for he's phenomenal when it comes to the transfer portal. He's a solid enough talent evaluator. But at the same time, just like you mentioned with the stops at Tennessee, with the stops at USC, and I was reading an article with ESPN senior writer Dan Wenzel, and essentially what he said is he compared this whole saga to back when he got fired from the Oakland Raiders back in 2007. And the whole reason why the Raiders fired Lane Kiffin back in 2007 was because Al Davis was sick of Lane Kiffin shit. And you kind of sit there and wonder, if he does leave Ole Miss, maybe Al Davis was right all along about him, even 20 years later.
Yeah, I think it's totally possible. If you bring up, some of these other guys, I think, Gus Malzahn would be a good hire somewhere else for a head coach, and I would also at Orgeron even the same. I don't necessarily know about Gene Chizik, only because I think he caught lightning in a bottle, at Auburn for those those small couple of years. I think you got a good couple of guys and you rode them to a national championship. And again, you can say, hey, my name is Gene Chizik. I'm a national championship winning coach. Sure. I definitely, if you gave me those 3, the choice of those 3, I'm definitely choosing, Gus and Ed O or over Gene.
Right.
But I think it goes to also show you that if he goes to LSU, a good quarterback is so important and so imperative in the quest to win a national championship. You go and look at the last 10 years and look at all the teams that have won and look at who was quarterbacking. It means so much. And I think you have to fight an even more of an uphill battle if you're, trying to win one. And, let's say, congratulations, you have, a Jamar Chase, or, congratulations, you have a Justin Jefferson, or you have a Malik Neighbors. Phenomenal. Who's throwing to him? Because there's a big difference in having a guy like Jalen Hurts, or we'll throw it a Jordan Travis, as opposed to having Diego Pavia, who again is he's a solid guy. I think he'll be an above average. He's an above average quarterback in college football right now, but I don't necessarily think that he's going to be that type of guy that pushes you over. You go back and look at some of these guys that were terrific NFL quarterbacks. Peyton Manning was a phenomenal NFL quarterback. Tom Brady, phenomenal NFL quarterback. Peyton wasn't, he was an above average quarterback in college. Tom Brady wasn't. But I think in the NIL days, it's so important to go out, whether you have to do, what Miami's done the last 2 years and going out and paying, $6 million for a quarterback, or you get lucky and you kind of recruit one. like Alabama's done a couple times. I think it's just having a good coach come in and being able to, like Lane does. He mentioned he's really good in the NIL. I think that's where you're going to have to start.
And another thing too, you mentioned some of the players on the team as well, and I'll shift this conversation in a slightly different direction. And